Just over 12 months ago, John and my sister Elizabeth and I were stranded in a little French village called Limoux. It's where Helen and Stephen have been staying. We'd been out for the day, travelling and looking at small villages round and about. And we'd caught the bus back to this little village in Limoux where we were to pick up the train to head back home to where we were staying in Carcassonne. The bus dropped us there and locals got off and tourists like us got off and various people got off the bus. And some of us hung about the station waiting for the train, trying, like John and Elizabeth and me, with our limited French to read the notices and see what the timetable said. Eventually, we discovered the train wasn't coming. The French people had got on their phones and they'd rung up here and there and they reported, and we understood as best we could, that there was a strike in Paris and there would be no trains. Not only would there be no trains, there would be no transport of any kind that could take us back to Carcassonne where we were staying. And so we looked at each other sitting on the grass in 40 degrees Celsius heat, our bottles of water running low, and thought, what next? The French people, phone to ear, wandered off. Other English speakers huddled together. They said they had options, they weren't fussed about working out a solution with us. And the three of us stood there looking at each other, wondering what next, when three young men from Pakistan with backpacks on wandered over towards us and offered to work with us on finding a solution to the problem. But first they said, we need to find a place to pray. It's time for prayer. So these three young men found a tap, undertook their ablutions, and then found a corner to kneel in. And despite the loud, disparaging comments from the other English speakers, they knelt to pray. And we hovered, not sure quite what to do. Then one of these three young Pakistani men rushed away, leaving us on the grass. The other two went into a huddle, and we still felt sort of puzzled and confused about what had just happened. Just as we were getting really anxious, the one who'd rushed off rushed back and said, I've got a solution. The English couple who'd said they had options still had options, and they weren't interested. But the three of us, plus the three young Pakistani men, talked a bit, and they said, follow us. So, not knowing what else to do in this heat, we trekked off after the three young men, who were really fast walkers, and we were told we need to hurry to keep up if we were going to make this arrangement. And they kept up a fast pace. One of them kept running back to see how John and I were doing because we were a bit slow. I think they were worried that we wouldn't make it in time. One of them kept rushing back and offering us encouragement, and then rushing away again and then back again as we went over bridges and down alleys and round corners, and we didn't know where we were going. Eventually we caught up with the guys, and we were told a school bus would come and take us to the village. It duly arrived, and only two of our Pakistani rescue team got on with us. The other one was a local, and he was staying. But the three of us got back to Carcassonne, and the two Pakistani men left us after a few selfies on their phones, and they headed off to find another mode of transport would take them to where they were really going. But we were very grateful to them, aware would have been in a bit of a pickle without them. But I've wondered since, if I would have been so willing to follow blindly a group of unknown backpacking Muslim men if we were stranded and lost in a subway in New York without the local language. It's been a challenge to me to think about that. And the gospel today put me in mind of that story. because I'm aware how very difficult it is for us to reinvest that over-familiar story of the Good Samaritan with the horror that the Jews to whom it was first directed must have felt on hearing it. Perhaps, just perhaps, imagining a member of ISIS helping a New York Republican might do it. Kindness from a bitter enemy? I've wondered if I could face it. Could you? Or I've wondered, would generations of social conditioning that has shaped and ordered behaviour and expectations about those who are so different from us sweep in and make me too afraid to be friendly, too afraid to receive kindness and concern from those whom I just am not sure about? I picked up a book a couple of weeks ago from George Armstrong called Applied Spirituality by Swami Agnavesh. And in this little book, there's a phrase: religions are meant to be nurseries of culture and hospitality rather than fortresses of hostility. Seems to me this little phrase is an indictment on the way things are between groups who are different today. It's a challenge that sits powerfully alongside the parable of the Good Samaritan, confronting us as Christians in our certainty and self-righteousness, born of generations of Christian teaching, generations of religious self-confidence, and generations of cultural imperialism. In our contemporary world, perhaps Brexit and the intercultural and interracial warfare within the USA today show up some of this fear, some of this hostility between groups of people who are different, who aren't part of those who are similar to us, whoever us are. Amos, the First Testament prophet speaking about 700 BC, is similarly addressing generational self-confidence and inherited common sense shaped by generations of storytelling that shaped culture and peoples. Amos is opening an ethical conversation about the social, religious, economic structures and cultural practices of Israel during the prosperous times of King Jeroboam. He speaks, as it seems all good prophets do, on behalf of God, and brings to his hearers an image of God measuring the degree to which the people have bent away from God's way by holding up a plumb line. God's measure, it would seem, has little to do with the established law or common practice or common sense as it had evolved, that right way to do things determined by generations of truths passed down. Nor does it seem God's way has anything to do necessarily with the prevailing version by dominant authorities of the way things need to be. King Jeroboam and his officials, both religious and administrative, are under scrutiny by God, as are the people who followed unquestioningly and benefited greatly in the prosperous times of that kingdom. Ethics, it seems to me, can be understood as that big framework, the big picture of what is in the best interests of the people, the right and just way of ordering behaviour and decisions, social and economic, that will be life-giving for all people, not only for a selected or privileged group. Amos is drawing this ethical concern to the attention of the people of Israel, to the religious authorities, and to the king, who, after all, has responsibility to order matters so that all the people are protected and have the means of a good livelihood. Amos cautions each of these aspects of the kingdom's administration with the message that God is not happy, that God will not pass over the people of Israel this time. He proclaims God has noticed what is going on, and that tilting away from God's way, forgetting the covenant expectations, is just not acceptable. There will be no escape from God's expectations or punishment. Well, obviously, the priest and the king tried to banish Amos. They wanted to turn a deaf ear to him, but they were warned that would not answer. Different frameworks were expected by God, systems and priorities that would measure up to a responsible care for all the people, systems for economic justice, for care for the land, for care for those who are in need. The king and those in responsible leadership were expected to provide an ethical framework that would attend to these dimensions of life. And God held the plumb line. God held the measure. The expectation that an ethos of care, of hospitality to stranger and to those who are different, to the other, is clear in Jesus' parable too. Hostility toward the other, self-protection and unthinking enactment of common mores so as to be seen to be doing what is right, is out. Accepting there is no other way than the one being promoted by popular media, that enmity and hostility to foreigner, to those who are different, might actually be in the national interest, or that those who are economically dispensable need no special attention, is simply not acceptable by God, who is still holding that plumb line, still holding that measure. Instead, the requirement in order to measure up is for hospitality and compassionate kindness, for an equitable distribution of wealth, even at the risk of our own good name and reputation, because we seem not to be acting according to common sense. When we hear the parable of the Good Samaritan, to really hear it, I think we have to drop off the rhetorical device that Luke uses to present the parable. That rhetorical device is the quizzing lawyer. We have to put him to one side if we really want to sense the power in the story and simply hear Jesus speak. Because that parable, familiar as it is dreadful. It's difficult. This parable turns upside down common sense about right and acceptable behavior. The parable describes the situation of enmity and rivalry and hatred between Jews and Samaritans that everyone knew. It was commonplace, and people behaved accordingly, protected themselves, didn't have much to do with each other. That was right. And that was how it would be and continue to be on into the future, generation by generation, for as long as these two peoples allowed it to be that way, for as long as they kept telling their story that way, telling the truth that way, telling who they were that way. But Jesus is telling it differently. Jesus is inviting a new story. Jesus is inviting hospitality, not hostility. relationship, not revulsion. Today, our context is not so different. Our context also has others to whom we are frequently hostile. And it's easy for us, with our inherited ways of seeing and doing, to reject those who are different. Different economically, different educationally, different socially, politically, and religiously. We readily leave them by the wayside, sleeping in doorways, drowning in seas far from home, shut away and shut out, without clean water or the means to grow food crops. They are not us. They are not our concern. Life's easier without them. Amos the prophet challenges this. And Jesus the prophet and wisdom teacher challenges this too. For we are being invited once more to tell our story differently, to begin the shaping of a different common sense about who we are, about the priorities necessary for our time, about whom we should be in relationship with, about who we should be concerned for. We are being invited to consider the economic structures and priorities we support, and to question how the wealth, resources of the earth could be shared or should be shared more equitably. Perhaps we're being asked to rethink taxation, benefits, the role of WINS, MSD, all those places that have a concern and responsibility for care. Perhaps we're being asked to think how we use the power and the influence that we have in these matters. Amos' prophecy in a time of prosperity and Jesus' parable in a time of hardship for Jews both invite us to think again about ethics, about what is right, about our attitude to others, and about that plumb line which will show just how far we have to adjust to be true to God's way, to the Jesus way. Our story urgently needs still to reassert hospitality, economic justice, and love of neighbour. This is the story we tell here at St. Matthew's. This is the story we need to keep telling. Even if we're bored with hearing it, we need to keep speaking it. This is the story we need to tell to those who hold power amongst us today. And it is the story we need to tell our children and our grandchildren and those people we meet, we come across day by day in our regular lives. We need to tell a story about love and hospitality, about God's hope, about equitable sharing, about being kind to one another.